Okay, so we're recording, and I'm just going to put everyone on mute. So like I say, thanks again for attending. So this call is about Dementia UK, which is our Tring Parish summer charity. The purpose of the call was that actually it can be for anyone who's listening or watching, for anyone who has got experience of living with those with dementia, who are experiencing it right now, who are worried for themselves for the future, or if you're just curious about how we can welcome people with dementia into our churches and services. We really want to kind of, even though we're supporting this charity, so that we want to do some financial investment in the charity in the next kind of a couple of months to raise money for them. We also want to raise awareness for ourselves as well on how we can, like I say, welcome those people better as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our expert speaker on the subject. So Pat Brown is an Admiral nurse, a specialist dementia nurse as well, who's been working as an Admiral nurse since 2007. She started in Kent, where she helped set up the East Kent Admiral Nursing Service as a clinical lead, and is currently working on the Admiral Nurse Dementia Helpline, which is the only nurse-led helpline in the country for families affected by dementia. Pat is a volunteer of her time this evening for us, and I know we're all really grateful for her time that she's taking out this evening to talk to us. So over to you, Pat.
Good evening. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to everybody actually for inviting me to come and talk tonight. Dementia is very close to my heart. As well as being an Admiral nurse, I have a relative who we care for who has dementia. And actually, I wouldn't say we care for her. She's part of our family, obviously, but we live and experience dementia as well as me working within that field. Sarah thought it would be really helpful for me to give a little bit of background to myself. I'm overwhelmed and really grateful, and I'd like to also say on behalf of the charity, thank you for fundraising for us. You wouldn't believe how much it means to us, and as a charity we wouldn't have Admiral nurses if people hadn't fundraised for us in the past and donated. So I'm very, very grateful for that. As Sarah said, I started out as an Admiral nurse in 2007, but actually humble beginnings. I lived abroad and came to the UK, and my first job was actually as a police constable. So I used to walk the beat in Kent, and it opened my eyes to many things. And interestingly, a chance encounter from someone with mental health problems made me decide to change direction. So I trained as a mental health nurse in the early 90s, and I have to be honest, there was a lot of stigma about dementia in those days and working with older adults, and thankfully that is changing. And I actually worked with younger adults initially until a chance encounter, and I believe in chance and providence. I supported some staff in a nursing home and a group of nursing homes across Kent, and it completely opened my eyes to people who may have problems affecting their thinking or cognitions, as they call it, and also people within care homes who may have dementia. And I'm very, very passionate. My experience was wonderful working in that field. And so when an opportunity came to become an Admiral nurse, I leapt at it. So that's a little bit about me. I thought we'd just give an overview today, but of course, if you need any further information and I'm unable to cover it or answer at the end, then please get in touch with me via Sarah, and I'll send any information that you might need after today. As I say, hopefully we'll cover most at the end in questions. Sarah, would you mind please just going on to the next slide? So I'm just going to give a little bit of an outline of this evening. I'm not really sure how long it will take. It'll take as long as it needs, and hopefully you'll come away with something. This won't be relevant for everyone, but there might be something really useful, which I hope there will be at the end of the evening. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what dementia is. Also, because the symptoms of many of the common types of dementia are common to other conditions, I'll explain when it's not dementia, because there's a lot of fear, and some of it is understandable, but also some of it is unnecessary around dementia. And sometimes it's really important to know when it's not dementia as well, because there are many conditions which are treatable. And as I say, sometimes we get the diagnosis wrong. Also, in the context of thinking positively, there's so much positive work going on around dementia. There's some recent research, which I'll talk about in the presentation, but there's also a lot of things we can do to prevent the risk to ourselves of developing dementia. So I'll talk about what can be really helpful from a practical sense, as well as, you know, from an individual sense, what might be helpful to someone who is living with dementia. Some of the things that may be less helpful, perhaps. I think as an Admiral nurse, we have a firm belief there's no right or wrong. Everyone is completely different and individual. And I know this from my own experience with my own relative. Everyone intends to try and help someone else for whatever difficulties they have. So I wouldn't be ever saying that this is the right way or the wrong way. Everyone is different. And as long as we intend to aim for the best for that person, I think that's the right track to go along. So we'll talk about things that may be less helpful, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong. And then because you're supporting our charity, I'll briefly just talk about Dementia UK and how Admiral Nurses came about, because we are unique to Dementia UK. Thank you, Sarah. So, NHS England talk about dementia as brain failure. So dementia in itself isn't really a diagnosis. It's really a description of a set of symptoms. And the most common symptoms are memory loss. You also might find that the person has some problems with reasoning or their communication. Some particular types have particular symptoms, and I won't go into too much depth, but I'll explain a couple of those. But those symptoms alone are not enough to warrant a diagnosis of dementia. The process of getting a diagnosis is very complicated, and so it should be. Because as I said earlier, there are many other conditions where you might have memory loss. Classic one is a vitamin B deficiency. So the actual diagnosis includes having all those symptoms, but in addition to that, what we'd expect to see is a reduction in day-to-day functioning over a period of months. So that's not just days or weeks. So when we talk about a reduction in functioning, there is whatever the memory loss is causing or the problems with reasoning or communication, we are also seeing changes at home in things like being able to get up in the morning, spend time with others, perhaps prepare drinks and prepare your meals, getting dressed. Those type of day-to-day functions, we would notice over months some change. And those all collectively, like a pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and talking to the person who's affected, talking to their family, carrying out various tests. It's quite a protracted thing, but that is how you get a diagnosis of dementia. And the reason I've explained that is because sometimes assumptions are made. The sort of calls I've been having to the helpline might be from a family member who say, I'm really worried, you know, my parents gone into hospital suddenly, they become unwell, and the staff are saying they suspect they've got dementia. Yet 6 weeks ago, there was no problem at all. And the problem is with stigma attached to this diagnosis, once that's been mentioned, sometimes assumptions are made about that person. So the formal diagnosis is very, very important, because we wouldn't want someone to be diagnosed without going through that process or be assumed to have dementia without looking at other possible causes. And that description I've just given you, where the family member is telling us, actually, this is so different to my parent, this wasn't evident weeks ago, is why it's so important that we listen to families as a whole, because that information is their expertise in the person that they know. And the people in the hospital or other professionals that may get involved would not know that person to that degree. So dementia, as I say, it's an umbrella term. That's why in the image you've got an umbrella there. I've listed here sort of the most common forms, but actually there are over 200 subtypes of dementia. The most common is Alzheimer's disease. And there are misconceptions about Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Some people think they're two separate things. And I've had relatives come from a memory clinic where they've had a diagnosis and they say, "Whew, he's got Alzheimer's. I thought it might be dementia." They're actually one of the same thing. But 60 to 80% of people who have dementia have a form of Alzheimer's disease. And it's very difficult, even with all those tests, to categorically say it's this particular type of dementia, because we don't have the ability to look really deeply inside the brain when that person's alive. So we rely on scans, etc. But Alzheimer's is characterized by some changes in the brain. So a bit like tangled wool, they're called tangles. And then you get these protein deposits that really shouldn't be there, that the body should have gobbled up or got rid of. And in fact, there's a lot of research and evidence that shows many of the types of dementias underneath this umbrella are caused by rogue proteins that have entered the brain that shouldn't be there. So already we're thinking proteins, maybe diet can help. There are things that can help. But Lewy body dementia is named after a gentleman who identified spherical proteins in the brain. So that's another common type. 5 to 10% people with Lewy body dementia, of all the dementias, will have hallucinations and certain movement problems that are similar to Parkinson's. Vascular dementia is just a very clinical way of talking about circulation that is causing a dementia. So a lack of circulation, a lack of oxygen in the brain caused by either strokes or mini strokes, or people who may have chronic problems like chronic obstructive disease, where they're not getting enough air in. So they've got a respiratory problem. And because they're not getting enough air in their body, not enough oxygen is feeding the brain, and that can cause damage. So vascular dementia is a whole collection of circulatory type problems that are affecting the brain. And then you have frontal temporal. So that's talking about the lobes in the brain that are affected. And as we go through, I'll explain how different parts of the brain, you'll see different behaviors, you'll see different symptoms. So frontal temporal dementia is where the damage in the brain has occurred on the frontal lobe, and the temporal lobe is just above. And then you have the other sort of not so common dementias. So you have Parkinson's disease type dementias, but only about 10% of people who have Parkinson's disease will go on to develop a Parkinson's dementia. Years ago, I'm showing my age now, we had CJD, also known as mad cow's disease. That's a prion disease where proteins again entered the brain that shouldn't have been there and caused damage to the brain cells. So CJD could cause a form of dementia. Would you mind passing to the next slide, please? So I'm not trying to present a doom and gloom. I guess where we're talking about numbers, and the next two slides are talking about numbers and who's affected, it's really more to highlight how much more common it's becoming. That not only is it becoming more common because it's in our awareness and we hear a lot in the media and the newspapers, etc., but actually more people are developing dementia. And partly that is due to the fact that although it's not caused by old age, the risk of getting dementia when you're past the age of 90 increases, and we're all living longer. So the figures are going up. At the moment, it is a progressive condition, and at the moment there is currently no cure. That doesn't mean that you can't live a good quality of life with dementia. And what tends to happen when we're talking about the leading cause of death, for example, is, as with many long-term conditions, they very rarely happen in isolation. You'll very rarely get someone of advancing years with dementia who doesn't have another condition. And that can make it quite complicated, but also can increase the risk for that individual. So at the moment, it is the leading cause of death in the UK, but that tends to be because it's complicating other conditions that person has. The next number, over 850,000 people with dementia in the UK, that's a bit of an arbitrary figure because it's very hard to get a diagnosis. It's getting better. Most people on average wait 3 years before they get a confirmed diagnosis after first symptoms. There are also a lot of younger people who get missed because there are quite a rise in people under 60 and under 65 who are developing dementia. But what is undoubtedly a worry for the government is that the cost is important to them. And actually, the care of people with dementia is actually more than cancer and heart care put together. And when I talk about how common it's becoming, every 3 minutes somebody in the UK will develop dementia. And the important thing for our charity, and the important thing for me as an Admiral nurse, is how wonderful family carers are. They save the government over £56 billion per year, because most people will live at home supported by a family member, and that's what most families would want. But who looks after the family and who provides them the support? You know, we wouldn't want family relatives not to be heard, not to be listened to, not to be supported. The case that I mentioned earlier on about the relative calling the helpline was that nobody in the ward listened to them when they said, "This isn't my dad, this is all new." So our value is in the family. We look at the whole family and aim to support them. And sometimes there is another misconception in that when we talk about Admiral nurses and they're linked to people with dementia, there's an assumption that we provide the hands-on care for the person with dementia. Well, actually, that last statement about family carers, the family carers are our priority, and that's not to take away anything from the fact that the person with dementia is an equal priority, but we do not deliver hands-on care. We will help coordinate the right support and the expert support for the person living with dementia. But the reason why majority of Admiral nurses are mental health nurses is because we do appreciate the emotional impact that that can have, a range of emotions, not all difficult emotions, but they may need support with that. And that's why it's very important that it's clear that most Admiral nurses, we won't provide a service where we'll sit at home so the family carer can go out, for example. And the only situations where an Admiral nurse may be delivering hands-on care, maybe if you've got an Admiral nurse in a hospice setting, for example. And we have more Admiral nurses growing now within hospices. Would it be okay to move on, please, Sarah? So I mentioned about younger people who may have dementia in the UK. So we've got at the moment, it's about 42,000 younger people with dementia. So this historical view that it only affects people, it's an old age condition, is incorrect. And as I say, this is a growing number of people who may be presenting to the doctor with problems, and because they're young, and we have people in their 40s and 50s who are developing forms of dementia more and more now, but they may not be considering, the GP may not be considering that this person may need to go to a memory clinic because they're not thinking dementia. They might be thinking depression, they might be thinking some other condition affecting the brain. 7.1% of the whole population over 65 have dementia, and a person's risk of developing dementia rises as they age. So it's about 1 in 14 who are over the age of 65, and then that rises to 1 in 6 when you reach 80 years plus. So old age does not cause dementia, but as I've mentioned, the risks increase as we age, just like the risks increase of us having circulatory problems, hypertension. And when you think of the earlier slide where we're talking about vascular dementias being one of the top 3, it's understandable that as we age, the risks that might contribute to us having a vascular dementia increase as well. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so these are the main things that we might notice that might just give us a little flag thinking, wonder if we need to check this out. We might notice it in ourselves, we might notice it in people around us. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the dementia at this stage, but it's worth just checking. So if you're having any of these symptoms or behaviours over a period of months, and there's no other explanation why this might be happening, then it's worth checking it out. You can ring the helpline or speak to an Admiral nurse in confidence and just find out what you feel you might need to do next. So memory difficulties are the most common, But as I've mentioned, and I'll mention again, there are lots of different treatable causes and conditions that may cause memory problems as well. There might be difficulties with thinking. So for example, processing new information. So we know our route, we go the same route in the car, but when we're going somewhere different, following a process or a sequence of events may prove difficult. That's difficulties with thinking. Difficulties with doing. When I talked about day-to-day functioning, you'd be surprised how many different actions you have to do to make a cup of tea, for example. So for me to go and make a cup of tea, I've got to go in the kitchen, I've got to get the right receptacle out, so I've got to get my kettle ready, get my mug, go and get the pot of tea bags, find the right cupboard for the tea bags, put the right amount of water in the kettle, etc. Now that can be really problematic for someone whose dementia is causing them difficulties with doing. And one of the ways of assessing someone's functioning at home might be getting a specialist like an occupational therapist to come to the house and just ask that individual to make a cup of tea and see if, you know, they can manage that without any problems. Communication difficulties, they vary. They vary. I mean, of course, if you've got memory problems, it might make communication difficult anyway. But there is a part of the brain, at the back of the brain, that helps us with language. And you can get, with some forms of dementia, where we call it receptive dysphasia, where the receiving of the information is really difficult to understand. So you could be talking to me very slowly and coherently, and I could be talking back very coherently, but I'm not understanding what you're telling me, so I'm not receiving that. The alternative is what we call an expressive dysphasia, where that information I'm receiving really, really easily, and I know exactly what I want to say, and the sentence is in my head, but when I go to say it, it's all mixed up. It comes out like gobbledygook. Now that's called expressive dysphasia, and there's a particular part of the brain that is responsible for our language. So you might notice someone who cannot express, although they perfectly understand what they want to say and want to do, but they cannot say it verbally. And that's where the communication difficulties might come in. Thank you, Sarah. So I don't want to get bogged down with this this image of the brain, but it does go to explain, just as I mentioned about the language, why everyone is different. So for example, we could have 4 people who have come away from a memory clinic with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. But if 2 of those 4 have got damage mostly in the front part of the brain, the frontal lobe, and the other 3 maybe in different other lobes, you will see different symptoms. They will have different difficulties. And then you add to that person's personality, you add to that other conditions that person may have, you'll see that every person is an individual. So whilst it is helpful to know what type of dementia that person may have, it's helpful to them to know if there's treatments that can help. What's more important is the individual. What's the impact on them? What's the impact on the family? How can we do more that make it a bit easier for them? How can we do less of what makes it more difficult for them? So if we look at the brain here, the frontal lobe, and you'll see this with people who've had car accidents, who've been hit in the front part of the head, you might notice changes in someone's ability to plan ahead. You might see some emotional changes. Somebody might become very, very upset or very garrulous, and that's very out of character for them. Or you might find that it's a bit like their starter motor isn't going. They don't seem to want to do anything, and that's beyond their control. It's almost like the motivational button isn't switched on, and that's their executive function. So frontal lobe, you'll see these sort of difficulties. You might see some real personality changes. But equally, I've known some people who have frontal lobe dementia whose taste is affected, and the families will say, do you know what? All the usual things my relative used to love eating, they're not wanting now. And some families say, I've gone through 3 jars of jam in 2 days. So strong sweet flavours or really savoury flavours, they'll notice those sort of changes. So it's really important we hear how each different type of dementia is affecting that person. At the back, we've got the occipital lobe, and it says vision. So it's not that we're not seeing with the eyes. The eyes are seeing the object, but the brain isn't interpreting what it is they're looking at. You might see someone who has damage in the parietal and occipital lobe who keeps bumping into things. So the worst thing is a beautiful color-coordinated bathroom, for example, that's all very neutral and cream. Everything looks exactly the same and it'll merge, and the cistern and the sink will not be obvious to that person who's got damage in that part of the brain. And that's why sometimes we hear from relatives who say, oh, they've missed the loo again. It's, you know, it's not that they don't know where the toilet is, as they can't see it. And therefore we would recommend something like a bright red toilet seat, which you can get on the internet and you can get for various sites, and the problem is solved. Red and yellow are the best colours for memory. Red and yellow is used as a background for signs. Red and yellow, if somebody's bumping into furniture, is really helpful to identify edges. And simple things like insulating tape on the edges of the corners of tables, across changes in levels on the floor, can be so helpful to a person with dementia. If you want to see a purpose-built room or a flat that is so helpful environmentally for someone with dementia, or if you're thinking of how best to adapt the church, for example, or your own home, then the University of Stirling has got a website where there's a visual tour, and it gives you lots of tips about the use of colour, the use of surfaces. So where we're talking about the occipital lobe, for example, a shiny floor will look like it's wet to someone who has damage there, and they will try and step over it, because as we all would, so that's normal behaviour we're seeing because of something abnormal happening in their brain. So the normal instinct, if we see a big wet puddle, is to want to step over it. And that's why you might see someone, when they come to a shiny dark floor, who keeps lifting their leg up. So this gives us an indication of some of the needs. And I hope it's helpful just to get an idea of how the different parts of the brain show themselves where there's damage in the behaviours that you might be seeing. Thank you. So some of these I've mentioned may be symptoms, but they alone don't mean that that person has behaviour, has dementia. Many conditions will mimic those symptoms. As we age, our body's ability to adapt to changes in its chemistry is not as good as when we were younger. So for example, if you're in your 40s or 50s and you have a raging temperature, or you become dehydrated, or you become anemic, or if you're deficient in, say, vitamin B, you normally notice something is wrong and go and see the doctor and you're treated for it. Our body chemistry doesn't work as efficiently after the age of 65 and onwards. So simple things like a rise in our body temperature caused by an infection, a wee infection, becoming dehydrated in this sort of weather, becoming deficient in vitamins, they can send us into a delirium or a confusional state, or they may produce some of the symptoms I've mentioned. But all of those are easily treated. So though I'm mentioning these symptoms, don't think, please, that these alone mean that person's getting dementia. It's just to make you aware. Okay, next slide, please. So the reason I mentioned delirium is this is the commonest reason an older person is admitted to hospital. That they become unwell, they become confused, which actually makes the problem worse. So say, for example, my body chemistry is not working so well because I'm aging, we've had all this hot weather, I'm forgetting to drink, my memory's starting to get worse because I'm starting to get dehydrated, and then I'm becoming more confused. And the more confused I am, the less likely I'm going to remember that I need to drink, that I need to take off Bacardi, and therefore I'm on that continuum of moving down to a stage of acute confusion. And when I get to that stage, that is quite a dangerous state to be. Delirium is treatable. It's often overlooked. it's very rare for any of the dementias to suddenly see a sudden behaviour change. A sudden behaviour change is more likely to be a treatable condition or a delirium, an acute state of confusion. So it's unrecognised. Many people go into hospital, they're really well, they might then have a fall, have a little fracture, or they might have to go into hospital because they've got a terrible infection, and in hospital they acquire a delirium. That is very common as well. So it's really important, and there's a big drive at the moment for nurses and doctors in hospitals to recognise delirium. There's a big drive to recognise things like sepsis, but equally delirium, particularly in an older person whose body may not be able to manage chemical changes quickly. That is really, really important that we know when a patient is delirious. And the aim is really that you treat delirium at home. We want to avoid people going into hospital unnecessarily, particularly at the moment. So that is one thing where the symptoms are almost identical to some of the common symptoms of dementia, but it's not dementia. Would you mind please move to the next slide? So forgive the medical terms. I think we might have to click to get those highlighted, Sarah, sorry. So delirium or acute confusional state, if you could click the button, it's not coming on, don't worry. So you'll get fluctuating confusion. These are the obvious symptoms, but you can get what we call a hypodelirium, where the opposite happens, where the person suddenly seems completely inactive, might be very, very, very sleepy. You're not seeing anything obvious except that it's almost like a shutting down. So that's still a delirium, but it's called a hypo, so it's underplayed. Delirium comes on suddenly. That's the next click, please, Sarah. So it comes on really suddenly. And the next click, please. It doesn't last very long with treatment. So say the delirium has been started because of a urine infection, you put somebody on antibiotics, they very soon recover. You might get impaired attention right at the bottom. Some people might see or hear things that aren't there. They might hallucinate. Please, can we have the next slide, Sarah? A little table here to show you the main differences. Dementia, you'll see gradual symptoms coming on. With delirium, comes on really quickly. So if somebody tells me they weren't like this before, this has all happened in the last week or so, I wouldn't automatically think this is dementia. What is very, very clear though, is people who have already got dementia, they have a much higher risk of becoming delirious than someone who doesn't. So it's always something as an abnormal nurse will look out for and check for, because it's easily sorted. With a person who already has dementia, delirium can even be caused by changing environment. So we often get calls after Christmas periods or Easter where families have gone away to meet other relatives, and they've taken their relative who has dementia with them. And when they come back home, they say, something's different. They seem worse than they were before. And what we have to advise is, well, you know, the brain is trying to catch up. It's got all completely new routines, and that in itself can cause a delirium. The person who's delirious will seem physically not well. They just don't seem right. Where the person with dementia may have all the other symptoms, but generally may be physically well. So there's the other main difference. Don't worry too much about the others. It's just important to be aware to always think delirium first. Thank you. And depression. I think it's a bit of, it's underestimated how many people experience mood changes in older age, or even not in older age, beyond the age of sort of 60 plus. People with dementia, of course, they're going to get depressed. And it's whether depression is to do with circumstances, which is normal. You know, if you're losing certain functions, for many people, the importance of having a car and independence and being told you can't have a driving license, then of course we'd expect to see some mood changes, because that would be the case for any of us who may feel that your independence might be threatened. But with some types of dementia, particularly vascular types, where you might have mini strokes or a stroke that causes the dementia, there is a chemical change that causes a clinical depression. And it's very similar. If you go to the Stroke Association or the Stroke Society website, you are almost always with a large stroke will have a clinical depression. So it is often overlooked, and the symptoms in someone who hasn't got dementia are very similar. You'll have some concentration difficulties, you'll have some memory problems, you'll have some problems with saying what you want to say, you'll sort of lose track. All those similar symptoms, we need to also think, as well as delirium, let's rule out depression as well, because there are treatments, not only medication, but there are activity type treatments that can help the mood as well. But also it would help us know if the depression might be as a result of a stroke, for example. So that person might need a scan. So these are when it's not dementia, but the symptoms may be very, very similar. And these would be the things we would want to exclude. So somebody, particularly early morning awakening, when they're not usually an early riser, waking up at 4 or 5 a.m., that's a common sign of depression. Changes in weight. Motor retardation, what a sentence that is. It's really slowing down of your movements, really. You might find that that person, their get up and go is gone. That you've lost a bit of appetite, perhaps, very tired, might actually be saying how they feel. Very important to just check for depression. Thank you. Okay. As I say, it's not all doom and gloom. There was a recent article, and it came out this month in The Lancet by a group of psychiatrists, and they've highlighted 12 things that people can do to reduce their risk of developing dementia, but also included in that article in The Lancet, some activities, we call them psychosocial, some activities that are really, really helpful for people who have got dementia or who have cognitive impairment. When I talk about cognitive impairment, and when we talked earlier about how you get a diagnosis of dementia, it might just help to know that there are some people who have what we call mild cognitive impairment. So they might have memory loss that's noticeable, but over a period of time, that doesn't really change. And they may never, ever develop dementia. Only a small proportion of people who have mild cognitive impairment will go on to develop dementia. And remember, developing dementia means that there is a significant impact on day-to-day functioning as well over a period of time. So some people who you notice may have memory problems or communication problems. If that remains pretty static for a period of time, then they may just have mild cognitive impairment that doesn't change. They may not have dementia. And I think that distinction is really important when you think about some current thoughts about the stigma associated with dementia and the fact that at the moment we don't have an identifiable cure, although there's lots we can do. So I think it's really helpful to know that there are a group of people who have mild cognitive impairment, but it isn't dementia. So for a person who is living with dementia, and going back to saying everyone's different, some people live on their own, quite independently, with some practical supports at home for many, many years with certain types of dementia, without needing extra support in their home or family support. And the important thing is, let's get to know the person. What are their strengths? What are their abilities? My relative, their strongest strength is their personality. They're the most wonderful wit, almost sarcastic sometimes. And when that's still present, I feel that is them working at their best. That's really focusing on their strengths. They're very good at interacting with others and therefore need to be around others. That's my relative's strength. So identifying what that person's really, really good at, doing more of it. So if for example, we're talking about a nurse or a teacher or someone who's been in a helping profession, who's developing early stages of dementia or who's had a diagnosis, how can we best use all that knowledge and skill and keep that person involved? I know a particular lady who's such a nurturer. She's an amazing lady and was feeling it because she'd recently had a diagnosis, and was also feeling a little bit embarrassed because you know, where she'd flourished and spent time demonstrating how skilled she was and her need to help, that was, she felt, taken away from her by her diagnosis. And so one way to bring out all those wonderful strengths and abilities was to engage her more with people who would really benefit from her skills. And we actually worked alongside the staff at Age UK, and she helped arrange groups and became really actively involved with Age UK. And that lady is just amazing. And that's one example of focusing on strengths and abilities. Around the country, we have what's called men's sheds. I don't know if you know of men's sheds, but it's activities in the community solely for men, particularly men who are adept at DIY. So that's not my husband, but who are very practical. And if that's their strength and their ability, let's nurture that. Let's use that more. The emphasis on looking at that individual will help us to think of what might be the best way to help that person. So if that person is struggling, for example, with language, don't expect to have the answers. I don't always have the answers, and I've been working in this area for a long, long time. I think it just helps to know that somebody understands. We call it validation. So, John, I can see you know what you want to say, and it must be so frustrating that you can't get that out. Let me see if I can help. Would it help to write it down? That might be an example of helping somebody who you've identified has that particular difficulty. I've mentioned about the use of colour. So if you're finding you're having to repeat sentences because that person's short-term memory is affected, it would really help to have a poster of that instruction, be it how to use the phone or use the TV remote or who to call by the phone with a red border, stuck to the phone maybe, or stuck by the kettle. So, for example, a red tray. This is a really thing that could be a really useful thing. A red tray placed and kept in a place where the person with dementia will frequent throughout the day. So a red tray by the kettle, leave it there. Every time that person goes to make a cup of tea, their brain will register the red tray, even if they don't take it in. Repeated exposure will help the memory because it will move from short-term memory to mid-memory. Then start putting your messages on the red tray. Messages for the day on the red tray, car keys go on the red tray, spectacles go on the red tray, the pill box goes on the red tray. Then if that person is in a train of thought and loses that train of thought because of their memory difficulty, automatically over time, they will go to the red tray first, rather than perhaps ask you, or rather than perhaps pick the phone up and ring. So little things like the use of colour and simple aids can be really, really helpful. Please, can you put your shoes on? It's raining outside, and remember your Mac, and let's go. We've only got 5 minutes. How many instructions in that sentence? Short, chunked sentences can be really, really helpful. It's raining outside. Your shoes are here. It's wet. Put these on. You know, those sort of short sentences are much more helpful than long instructions. By the time you've got to the end, it's a bit like a Chinese whisper. You're wondering where you started and what you're supposed to be doing. I had to do a video some time back for Dementia UK and read off a script, but then look and remember the script. And the longer sentences, I was getting all back to front, you know, and hopefully, you know, after practice, that became better. And therefore, practice, exposure to the same thing does help short-term memory loss. Try to keep things as normal as possible for that person. I've spoken to many people who've just received a diagnosis of dementia, and they said, it's interesting. The people I spoke to the week before are now talking to me and behaving with me completely different, and only a week has passed. And the only difference has been I've had a diagnosis in the meantime. Their normal has changed overnight. It doesn't have to. Try to keep things as normal as possible for them whilst support them as needed. There's a couple of really good websites for memory aids, gadgets, technology. An example of where technology can be helpful is you can get these pill dispensers that you load up a week ahead, and they lock, and they'll only open when an alarm bleeps when the pill is due, and then the next dose will only open when the next pill is due. Things like that can help someone retain their independence at home, make them feel, competent, reliant. There's the tray, and that's a memory aid that you're not really spending out on. But there's a couple of websites, and I've put the links at the ends of the slides. One's called Ask Sarah. It's for anyone with any disability. So, for people with stroke who have problems in their brain, the gadgets there are equally as useful for someone with memory problems because they have dementia. You can apply for a hidden disability lanyard. So it's a lanyard like this. There is a website, and many large organisations like supermarkets, cinemas, they will identify a hidden lanyard. They'll know that person may need a little bit more support, not to be rushed, etc. So that can be really, really helpful for a person with dementia as well. I mean, the list is endless. There's lots we can do. I think let's just treat everyone as we would want to be treated ourselves and as an individual, and we can't go far wrong. That's my motto. Yeah, thank you. Next slide, thank you. Some of these I've mentioned. Actually, the church, and I'm not plugging the church because you've asked me to come, but it's a wonderful, wonderful place for someone who has cognitive problems. Because when I spoke about psychosocial approaches, these are non-medical approaches that really tap into our social being, our need to be with others. So the church offers that. Music is wonderful, absolutely wonderful for someone who may have any form of dementia. Years ago, when I worked in the community, we used to arrange a taxi to pick up two ladies in Dover. They would only go once a week to a music group, and we would sing well-known songs. And one day the taxi didn't arrive, so I had to go and pick them up with a colleague. And we turned up in our car, and these two ladies who are not related were standing there waiting for their taxi. And we said, "Hello, ladies, where are you going?" And they said, "We don't know, but we know we love it." And that is a really good example of where the emotional side actually is much, much stronger than the memory. And as memory becomes more impaired, the emotions become more at the forefront. But the singing group was absolutely wonderful, and people can participate even if they don't want to sing. They can play an instrument. We carried out a research project with our music group, and in terms of emotional well-being and positive aspects of living with the dementia, it was fantastic. And you get that through singing in the choir or joining into singing. Thinking of environments like churches, like other public places, when I mentioned about red and yellow, if you're going to have a sign that directs you to where the bathrooms are, for example, or where to hang your coat, put the sign on a yellow background with an arrow pointing to where it is. It might be worth, as well as writing bathroom or toilet, to have the image of a toilet. Purely because some people whose language or vision or the ability to read might be affected, they will still recognize an image. So a picture of a toilet or a picture of a bathroom. The best kitchens actually have glass doors. You can see exactly what's behind the door. You're not having to open 6 doors before you find the crockery you want. Taps need to be easily opened and easily moved because, as I've said, some forms of dementia you'll get movement problems similar to Parkinson's. Floor surfaces, really busy floor surfaces may not be helpful, might look like they're moving. Particularly stripes, zigzags, where you've got changes in the level of surfaces, like from one door entry to another, best to mark it out in a red tape or a red border. As I say, there's a really good website at the University of Stirling that talks about adapting environments. Relatives can be so helpful. So if you're going to an event, be it at a church or anywhere else, share in private with the organisers what the individual needs are and see whether they can be adapted. You know, for someone with visual problems, you might need large print, for example. Hearing problems, be nearer the front. For someone who may have issues around continence, you'll need to be sitting and reserve some seats that are right near the bathroom so that it's easy to get to where you need to go to. Arrows and signs are fantastic, telling people where to go rather than having to ask or feel confused. Sometimes it's helpful if you've got a really big event to do a dry run. So have a practice before, just so that person gets to know the layout and you can immediately see whether there might be any difficulties. Thanks, Sarah. We're all human. When I get some calls from the helpline, some of the most challenging aspects of trying to support someone, as I say, everyone's different, maybe where the relative may have had numerous calls throughout the day, 20, 40, 50 phone calls, or being asked the same question again and again. That isn't the person's fault if they've got a memory problem. But equally, you have to understand that for that relative, that may be difficult at times, which is where if it's a particular question that's being repeated, it might help to write it on a whiteboard, the answer. And then rather than say, I've told you, or, you know, tell me what it is you want, you can say, do you know, it's really great that we've got the whiteboard. Let's go and look at the whiteboard. The answer's there. It might be, if it's around phone calls, which can be quite difficult, it might be that you pre-dial a number, so or use Careline, for example, so that that person can ring Careline first. The Careline will check and make sure that there's no immediate issue or no emergency, and then inform the relative who can call them back. So there are various different things that might make it more difficult for the person who is affected by these symptoms that's prompting them to ask, or prompting them to ask you to repeat. One of the most common side effects, if you like, of having memory problems or any of the symptoms I've mentioned is anxiety. You're going to feel worried and you're going to feel confused at times, and it is quite normal to feel anxious about that. For me, if I'm rehearsing something and I lose my train of thought, I'll immediately start to feel anxious, and that'll make it worse, actually. I'll start to get more confused. So that reassuring tone, that validation, I can see that you seem a little bit unsettled. Do you know what? That's so expected. You're managing this so much better than I would in your shoes. That's amazing. Let's just take our time. That sort of conversation can be really helpful, really reassuring, as opposed to, oh, we've got to get the bus. Come on. We've got to get the bus. We've got 10 minutes, feeling rushed. It's just going to make things worse. It's going to make you feel worse. It's going to make them feel worse. Being included is really, really helpful. I've mentioned about psychosocial things, which is non-medication. Being included in being part of a social group is really, really helpful. When I worked in the community, we arranged regular lunch clubs with a local pub. I know that's going to be difficult at the moment with COVID-19, but it was a set-aside room where a group of families, we would meet once a month and just have lunch without worrying about how long it took, whether we all did the right things, what the conversation was, but still retaining that social contact was really, really important. So not feeling included, or as I've experienced myself with my own relative, people talking around that person as if they're not there, it can be really, really difficult for them, and also affect their mood, quite understandably. You know, we hear from relatives what it feels like not to be listened to, not to be included. So imagine if you're already feeling not quite yourself, to feel further excluded or not important. That must be really, really difficult. And it does happen, sadly, but usually by people who don't know that person. You know, as I say, families are the experts. They know their relatives so, so well. Confusing environments, can make things difficult, and that's going to vary on an individual level. I've already mentioned about lots of questions at once. And while everyone is always well-meaning, even if it may not come out the way that we wanted, and as I said, there isn't a right or wrong way, and nobody will judge if you don't quite get it right or wrong, but it may not be as helpful if the person you're with who has dementia is trying to say something or express something, and you're speaking for them without giving them an opportunity or time to actually have a go. So these are minor things, but important. As I said, that research in the Lancet, it supports a lot of current research, that there is so much we can do, whether we have dementia or not, to make the risks of the dementia worsening or the risk of us getting dementia, to reduce that. Vascular types of dementia, you're at higher risk if you've got high blood pressure. You're at higher risk if you have heart conditions like atrial fibrillation. That's because with atrial fibrillation, the heart isn't pumping regularly. You get pools of blood that then starts to clot, and little clots break off, and those little clots can cause mini strokes. High blood pressure, again, will increase your risk of stroke. Smoking, you know, we can reduce smoking. Exercise, any form of exercise, whether it's chair-based, whether it's full-on, is going to be good for you. And that's because if we go back to the original slides where I said a lot of dementias, if you put it in simplistic terms, are a result of proteins and deposits that shouldn't be in our brain, that if we were physically fit, our immune system might gobble them up or get rid of. We can prevent those proteins entering the brain if we live differently, and if we try and have a healthy lifestyle. This can start any age. It can start and continue if we have dementia, but it can start before then. Managing stress will have an impact on our blood pressure. Getting good night's sleep. All of these things are really, really helpful. And this is why certain lifestyles and diet make some nationalities, some cultures more likely or less likely to develop certain forms of dementia. So high salt diets, like where I lived in Hong Kong, we have a lot of soy sauce, we have salt on absolutely everything. There's very high rates of hypertension and equally high rates of vascular dementia. So all of this, and if you are able to read this article, which you can read the whole lot without having to be part of the university, can be quite useful, but it's really positive. They're trialing some drugs that actually dissolve these proteins in the brain, and there are quite a few drug trials going on at the moment, so there are lots of medications that can help prevent that risk. There are medications they're developing for people who have dementia, and some that are out there that don't slow the progression, but they improve the cognitive function. So they improve the ability to process information, they improve the memory for a period of time. So the decline is not as quick as you might expect. So you can function better for longer. And that's what most of these medications that are out there do. They're mostly for Alzheimer's types dementias, or mixed dementia, which is a little bit of Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. And the reason I've mentioned that is because sometimes we get calls or people with dementia will say, why am I not being offered medication? Or why have I been discharged from the mental health team? And the reason is they may have a type of dementia where they're either not suitable or it's not licensed for their type of dementia to offer that medication. And therefore that team can't offer it. And therefore that team may have to discharge them. So it isn't personal, it's all related to that individual's diagnosis. If they've got heart problems, for example, some of the dementia medications are not safe. So it isn't really a postcode lottery. These medications are licensed, but under certain conditions. But that might be why you'll know that some people have medications to help manage and some don't. Thanks, Sarah. As you're so kindly, I'm mindful of the time, sorry, as you're so kindly supporting our charity, Dementia UK, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about it. Dementia UK is not the original name. It used to be called the Dementia Relief Trust, and it was one of a group of trusts that this wonderful philanthropist called Joseph Levy, he was quite a wealthy gentleman, and he funded many, many charities in London. Now, Joseph was a very keen sailor, and his nickname was Admiral Joe, and he had 2 daughters and a wonderful wife, and then he was diagnosed with vascular dementia. And as a result of their mum over the years supporting him at home and caring for him, the daughters noticed a change in their mum. So she was the family carer, and they searched everywhere to see if there was any service that would support the family directly. Because Admiral Joe, Joe Levy had quite a lot of support from various health teams, but their mum didn't. And the mum didn't either feel that her voice was heard. And so using the monies that their father had accumulated over the years, they set up the first Admiral Nurse service in London. And in tribute to him, we call them Admiral Nurses. So we're not related or affiliated to any naval services. It's really about Admiral Joe. So that's why we're called Admiral Nurses. You can't get an Admiral Nurse associated with any other organisation other than Dementia UK. So Dementia UK provides Admiral Nurses, and they work in various settings, which the next slides will explain. Thanks, Sarah. So our role really is to support the whole family, whether that's emotional support, psychological support, whether it's about offering some tips and guidance, whether it's about really showcasing how wonderful they're doing, and for the family member to feel, you know, I am doing okay. I just need somebody to tell me I am, you know, I'm on the right track here. It might be that. It might be about the Admiral Nurse writing to the GP, chasing up a diagnosis. It might be about them liaising with other staff. We've got over 300 Admiral Nurses at the moment, and we supported over 50,000 families last year. Next slide, please. So we're getting more Admiral Nurses who aren't mental health nurses, who are general nurses. A lot of them are working in hospice settings. Some are working in care home settings. The majority, though, are working in the community. Many are working for mental health trusts. So they work closely with the memory teams, but we are also working with GP practices in primary care. So before diagnosis, at diagnosis, and after diagnosis, the Admiral Nurse can stay for the whole continuum till end of life if needed, and after that person has passed away, we're there for the family. We're offering bespoke clinics as well. And as I mentioned, I've moved from working in the community to working on the Admiral Nurse Dementia Helpline. Next slide, please. So the helpline is open 7 days a week. It's on a free phone number, an 0800 number from a landline. You might get charged from a mobile, but it is purely staffed by Admiral Nurses who have worked for many years in the community first. So you won't get someone who's just qualified, who's never worked with someone with dementia. You can call or email. You can contact us through our website. It's a confidential service. If you email us, it goes into a confidential inbox, and only an Admiral Nurse will open that email and respond direct to you. If you ring, you may have to leave a voicemail. We've become extremely busy, but on a weekday, we're open till 9 p.m. and every weekend and bank holiday, we're open from 9 till 5. And it is a direct way of getting in contact with an Admiral Nurse if there isn't one in your local area. And even if there is, and they're not available, or you've just got a question you want to ask, you can still use the helpline. And there's our website. Now, there's a lot of leaflets. The most common ones are things like tips for communication, making the home dementia friendly, planning ahead, getting a lasting power of attorney. All of those are available electronically from our website. So you might want to have a browse. For people who have younger children or who have grandchildren and want to enhance their awareness about dementia, or maybe answer some of the questions they might ask about their relative, there's a video for young people, and it's probably aimed at around 8 to 12-year-olds, maybe a little bit younger, but it's really, really helpful interactive video for young people. When I talked about some of the gadgets and aids, the Ask Sarah Living Made Easy website is there. Have a browse, see what's there. There's things like those memory clocks, the lockable pill dispensers, the red toilet seats, a lot of the whiteboards, clocks that say what time of day it is, sensors on the front or back door that alert the person audibly if it's nighttime. Don't go out, it's nighttime, for example. All of those are on there, and the Live Better with Dementia website. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was incredible. I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of everyone. I will unmute everyone in a second, but that was so helpful on so many levels. You covered so many things in there. And like I say, this recording, in case you missed anything, will be available on our website too. But I'm going to carry on recording just while we open up for some questions for everyone. If anyone would like to ask anything, I've got a couple myself, but I'm going to hold fire and allow anyone else who might want to ask their own questions. So I've kind of given you the ability, all of you, to unmute yourselves if you want to. Don't all rush at once. I'll ask a question. So when you mentioned about the signs, with the yellow backgrounds, are there a particular font or colours that the writing should be? Should they be red writing on yellow backgrounds, or does that not particularly matter?
I'm not an expert on the signage. When I've had to order them out myself, or when people have ordered them from various websites or made them, they've made them according to the size and the font, which tends to be black on a yellow background, can be really helpful. And they've literally just copied it from those that you can purchase. So you can make your own if you've got a printer. And if you don't want to use too much yellow ink, as I say, a red border around an A4 sheet of paper with large font in bold black can be just as useful and cheap. So I think when I've diverted people or suggested look on the websites, it's not necessary to purchase from those, because I'm not recommending those websites above others, but you get really good ideas that you can just adapt for yourself. Other things you can make that you don't have to purchase might be things like rummage boxes. So for example, if you've got a practical person, it might be that you leave shoe boxes around the house that have got things like taps and washers, plugs that they can come across and keep themselves occupied indoors, particularly during lockdown. That's been invaluable for many people. So rather than buy... Sorry?
I think that was probably an accident.
Oh, okay. But yeah, I'm not sure of the font, Sarah, but the Stirling University website and those two links I've given you give you an idea of the most effective formats, if you like.
Yeah, Stirling Uni reference looks really good, and in what certainly one of our main, or our big church rather, in Tring, where we tend to use overhead screens that we have, so that's very easy to have yellow backgrounds on things if you think that kind of is more likely to draw the eye up there.
Yeah, it'd be fabulous actually. Those are the main colours. I think when we're talking about gadgets in the home, red sanitary ware, red borders, or blue can be quite useful as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Does anyone have any questions at all for Pat while we have her expert ear here?
Not so much a question, it's Mike Watkin. One of the sites that we've picked up on is the one called Active Minds, which has got a great deal of suggested activities as well as things to buy, but a lot of it is ideas about how to progress and deal with some of the challenges.
Thank you. Yes, there are a whole list. I mean, I can send further, but yes, sorry if I omitted Active Minds. As I say, I'm not recommending one site over and above another, but no, I think we're always learning, aren't we?
Very useful with some of the advice, not necessarily things to buy. It was
yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Mike. But again, I think it's very individual. It's not a one size fits all. Your knowledge about the person that you want to support or help is invaluable, because a lot of the activities or things you might try will be very specifically helpful for them, but may not be for another person. And that's where I think working together to explore what works, what doesn't, do more of what works and less of what doesn't, can be really helpful, those sort of conversations. And that's actually the sort of conversations we have on the helpline. You know, I've tried this, it's not been that helpful. Can we think about what else I can do? And that's fine. And we explore it together. I've learned an awful lot actually from those sort of conversations, much more than I would have learned from a textbook or from uni or whatever. So, you know, it's really key that those relationships with other people who might be involved with that person's care is nurtured, really.
I have another question that was given to me by someone who couldn't attend the call. Bit of a tricky ethical / moral question, but a dilemma that I'm sure lots of married couples in particular have, which is how to help people feel that they are still honouring their marriage vows when one has dementia. Tricky question, this person acknowledges, but if one person goes into a home, that it's not an abdication of responsibility or lack of love. It's this kind of real pull of guilt, I think, that this person is trying to get at, and how we, because we, you know, we often kind of, as a community, will have people in it that might pose those kinds of questions to us.
Yeah, and that's a really helpful question, because that is one of the most difficult decisions, isn't it, to make? And I think, as I say, it's a very individual decision as to at what point you either involve more support, at what point you even have support into your home when the person that you love and care for has maybe said, that's not what I don't want, that's what I don't want. I've never come across any family who have made a decision like placing someone in care who hasn't done it with a lot of angst and worry and wondering whether it is the right thing for them. What can be really helpful in that sort of situation is where early on, when you're having those conversations with your relative, you talk to them about long-term plans and get a sense of, you know, what they would want in the best of circumstances. But at the end of the day, there can be a number of reasons why it isn't possible to continue to keep that person safe and well at home. I've already mentioned sometimes, and very commonly, dementia has other conditions that accompany it. With the best will in the world, with all the love in the world and care, and with respect to what that person might have wanted, it may not be safe for them to continue at home. If you've got health needs yourself and you've been trying to support your loved one at home with you, that may have an impact on your health. And then the last thing you would want is a crisis. So it is a really difficult situation. As I said, I think we have to think of, on an individual basis, how best we support the whole family into making a decision that is necessary, whilst trying to reduce that sense of guilt, because we'll never not feel guilty about whether we did or didn't do the right thing in whatever circumstance for whoever. So all the while that you can have those open conversations, and while the person with dementia can still make decisions, have those conversations. Say, look, if I'm ever in the position where I might have to make a decision for you, know that I love you, know that I'm doing it in your best interest. What would you suggest to me would be the best way of going about it? So if they're able to have those conversations early on, then draw on that, because that actually will help going forward. Things like advanced decisions, advanced care plans, if you can make those early on together, apply to both of you, or have those conversations early on, that can be helpful. But if that isn't possible, share the whole process of making the decision with other people. And hopefully, when we have what's called best interest meetings for decisions like serious medical treatment or permanent residence or placements, you share that responsibility with other people. It won't make you feel any better, but might reduce that sense of guilt. We know that everyone's intentions are always sound. When you're talking about their loved ones, of course they love them and they're trying to do their best. And it may be that in order to do their best, they may have to go into a permanent supported accommodation.
One of the things that's brought home to me in a discussion about that level of guilt is and something to do with the stigma about what's seen as mental health. was that if they had cancer, you wouldn't hesitate in getting medical support and help with dealing with that. And it is as much of a disease as cancer, but don't always think of it as the same. But and then it starts to put it in better focus.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Mike. And I think there's a group of clinicians who are actually considering moving dementia from the realms of mental health more into disabilities and looking at it from a disability model. And certainly, personally, that's how I would look at it. It's not necessarily this is a mental health problem. This is a disability that's affecting that person, much the same as a stroke might do. And you're right. We try and meet that need that person's got with the best resources we have, and that resource may be the right resource, might be nursing home or a care home. And there's a lot of negative perceptions about care homes. We only hear about those that perhaps aren't doing so well in the press, but there are some fantastic care homes. And, you know, a little bit of sharing here. My relative is in a care home. She's thriving. She absolutely loves the environment. She thinks she's at work. The staff are wonderful to her. And she was getting very depressed living at home on her own. So we have to think about the individual. And as I say, Admiral nurses are there to support the family because we know these are difficult decisions.
Thank you. Any last questions at all for Pat? Okay. Well, again, I just want to say thank you so much for the time that you've taken this evening to go through all of this with us, Pat. Your expertise is really invaluable for us. And to everyone that's on the call, I prompt you all to donate, obviously, to Dementia UK, or at the very least to share all of this information and to be advocates of this amazing charity. To everyone that you come across, we'll be doing lots of stuff on social media to encourage everyone to donate to them too. So the more that you can tell everyone all about this would be really great. I'm going to stop the recording here as we all say goodbye to each other. So thanks again, Pat, for your expertise and help.
Oh, thank you all. I really appreciate it. And you know, I know you've also taken up your time to allow me to share the information. Thank you also for considering our charity. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.